Chapter 2, September 2014, Pleasant Hill, Las Vegas, Nevada. Retired detective Bayard Lott had just arrived home from the grocery store when the doorbell rang. It actually startled him, the high ding-dong sound. It had to be someone trying to sell him something, since no one he knew ever rang that doorbell. He didn't even know the stupid thing still worked. He had his arms full of paper stacks of snacks and soft drinks for the evening's poker game, plus a tub of Kentucky Fried Chicken he planned on having for dinner and to snack on the next few days as well. It smelled wonderful and made his mouth water as it filled the kitchen with promise. He loved KFC, never seemed to grow tired of it. A couple of his friends had said he was going to turn into a giant chicken leg if he wasn't careful and didn't balance the KFC with something green. He only ever shrugged at that. As a detective, he'd seen worse. It felt good to be inside the cool air, out of the heat of the early evening. It had to still be over 100 degrees outside, far too warm for the middle of September. The fall cooling hadn't really started yet. Even being in an air-conditioned store and car, just getting between places was hot. He dropped the supplies for the game and the chicken on the counter near the sink. The Cold Poker Gang met every Tuesday night downstairs in his basement poker room. He lived for Tuesday nights, he had to admit. Usually, there were 4 or 5 playing, all retired Las Vegas detectives. They got together, played cards, told stories about whatever, and worked on cold cases for the city. He felt he still had a lot to give to police work, and solving cold cases made him feel useful again. He liked that. All the members of the Cold Poker Game did, and he enjoyed the poker games as well. And KFC. Didn't get any better than a poker game with friends and KFC. His version of heaven. The doorbell rang again. "Yeah, coming," he muttered to himself, not buying anything anyhow. He made sure none of the sacks would tip off the counter and glanced at the clock on the stove. It was still a good hour before the game started. His best friend and former partner, Andrew Williams, was the only one who ever came early. He knew it wasn't Andrew because his old partner never rang a doorbell. It seemed to be against his religion, if he had one. He liked pounding his fist on the door for some reason.
Lott headed out of his kitchen and across the formal dining area and then the front room. His wife Carol had died 3 years before, and the living room looked like she was still there, sitting in her big recliner, watching the nightly news. He didn't really touch a thing in that room. It had been her favorite room in the house, and now he hired someone to keep it clean, but mostly stayed in the kitchen and the basement and watched TV downstairs in his remodeled gaming room.
Trying to watch television in the living room just got him thinking of Carol too much, and he did enough of that as it was. Damn, he missed her. As he headed for the front door, he ran a hand through his thick gray hair and made sure his badge and gun were close by on the end table near the door. He opened the door and was surprised to see retired detective Julia Rogers standing there, a Yankees baseball cap pulled down over her light brown hair to shade her face. She wore her standard tan slacks and white blouse under a light dress jacket. At first glance, she looked like a middle management worker on her way home from work, but the baseball cap didn't fit that image at all.
Rogers had joined the game 2 months before on the recommendation of his daughter, Annie. He liked Rogers a lot, more than he wanted to admit to himself at times. He found himself thinking of her out of the blue. But Carol had only been gone for 3 years, and he just didn't feel ready to have another relationship, even though Annie was at him all the time to get out more and relax. Annie had been the one to suggest he remodel the basement game room a year ago. She was worried about him banging around in the house all alone with only the memories of her mother. He understood that worry, but he still missed Carol every minute of every day. Nothing he could do about that. Carol was gone, he knew that. He was doing his best to move on with life.
That was one reason he liked the cold poker game games so much. Rogers actually had been a detective in Reno and had retired after having a bone in her leg shattered by a gunshot in a firefight with some drug dealers. She now walked with a slight limp that was hardly noticeable. She was only in her mid-50s and had moved to Las Vegas to get to warmer weather and to play poker. From what Annie had told him, she was a good tournament player and had won her share of tournaments around town. Rogers had bright green eyes that didn't seem to miss much, and her sense of humor often kept all of them laughing. She seemed to have no trouble at all being the only woman in the cold poker gang. "Sorry to come early, Lot," she said, smiling as he opened the door to let her into the coldness.
He could tell her smile didn't reach her eyes. Something was really bothering her. "No problem. You can help me with the snacks and drinks." "Love to," she said. She followed him back into the kitchen, where he grabbed a cold bottle of water from the fridge and handed it to her as she pulled off her baseball cap and shook out her long hair. Usually, she keep it tied back, but for some reason today, she hadn't done that. Compared to his 6-foot frame, she was almost tiny at 5'2", but he had no doubt she was the toughest 5'2" you would ever want to meet in a fight. And he and Ander had taken her to the gun range off Las Vegas Boulevard, and she was a better shot than both of them. "Wow, that smells good," she said, indicating the chicken as he worked at the sacks, suddenly feeling very odd. Besides Annie, Rogers was the first woman who had been in the kitchen since Carol died. He glanced around, actually looking at the room. He, or Annie, or the housekeeper, had put away most of Carol's things from the kitchen, leaving it just kind of bare. Standard white appliances, gray stone counters, and a big stone-topped dining table with 6 chairs around it. His cleaning service kept the kitchen cleaned and sparkling, but he seldom cooked much of a meal in it, and the fridge was full of takeout leftovers, usually boxes of KFC. "The chicken does smell good, doesn't it?" he said. "You hungry? I could use a piece." "What can I do to help?" she asked as he unloaded sacks of chips onto the counter near the stove, plus a large bag of peanut M&Ms from Ben the Sarge Carson. Sarge loved the things, but he often left most of the bowl full behind. Lot couldn't keep away from them no matter how hard he tried, so every week Lot had to buy another large bag. "How about just sitting there at the table, working on a piece of chicken, and tell me what's bothering you?" He slid the bucket of chicken over onto the table, then dug out some napkins and plates. She laughed. "That obvious, huh?" "I think the hour early sort of gave you away," he said, smiling at her. "What?" she asked, smiling back at him with a grin he could really come to enjoy. "Can't a friend just come to talk with another friend without there being something wrong?" "Of course," he said, shaking his head and going back to unloading the sack of chips and pretzels. "But that's not the case this time." "Got me on that one, detective," she said, as she dug into the bucket and put a chicken breast on her plate, licking her fingers off after touching it. Then she sat there in silence until he joined her at the table and took a leg and thigh for his plate. The smell was heavenly, and he had half the leg gone before he glanced up at her. "Not sure how to say this," she said. "Quickly usually works for me," he said. "Like pulling a bad tooth." She shook her head and laughed. "That's one way of thinking about all this." Then she looked him right in the eyes. He sort of jerked. She really was better looking than he thought, and those intense green eyes seemed to just look through him. He had noticed her a lot over the last 2 months, and had even admitted to his daughter that he enjoyed the games even more since Rogers had joined them. But until now, he had never been alone with her and really looked at her. Clearly, there was a connection between them.